Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another edition of Voluntaryist Academy, continuing on with our Men Against the State series. Men Against the State by James J. Martin. Great book. Went live last night, going live again tonight. We're going to do part 3 tonight. I'm going to continue on with the reading. Tonight's going to cover the colonial period. Utopia in Modern Times is the name of chapter 3. We'll get to that in a second. So there's a link to a PDF in there. There's a link for a PDF of this book in the show notes right now. Go back and check out part 1 and 2, get caught up on the playlist. Before I move on, I just got a copy of this great book, The Book That Changed My Life by Chris Jantzen. Chris Jantzen is a good friend of mine. He hosts the End Evil podcast. You can find this book for yourself and read it for yourself at endevil.life. There's a link in the show notes all the way at the bottom for this book. He's a good friend and a really, really bright individual. And I just really love his friendship, and I wanted to help promote his book. So I haven't read this. I just got it like a couple hours ago. It just arrived. So I haven't read it yet, but I'm sure it's going to be awesome. It's like a, it's a great, I can't wait for this book. And I also got a facsimile of The End of All Evil by Jeremy Locke, thanks to Chris. And you can get these for yourself at his website, endevil.life. And, find that link in the show notes. While you're here, do all the liking and subscribing and blah, 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 blah. All that stuff. I greatly appreciate it. So we've been covering the Warrenite period of American anarchism. That's what we've been covering in this book so far. Tonight we're going to get through the rest, well, not the rest of the book, of course, but chapter 3. So without any further ado, we can get to the reading. Okay, so chapter 3 is titled The Colonial Period, Utopia and Modern Times. The middle and late 1840s saw the collapse of the most numerous and the most ambitious of all the attempts of a non-political nature made toward producing socio-economic reform in American history. The intellectual revolt against social convention and the economic status quo, spearheaded by a restless intelligentsia, expressed itself during this time in practical adventures in the socialism of Charles Fourier and his brilliant associate Victor Considerant. The successors to the Owenites of the 2 previous decades, Fourierite colonies experienced a similar rise, popularity, and eclipse, surpassing their predecessors both in the meteoric nature of their rise and the abruptness of their decline. Josiah Warren, a keen student of Fourierism. Yeah, I think that's how you pronounce that. Fourierism. Well, hold on one second before I continue. I do want to read this footnote. Okay. The word socialism meant many things to different persons in the mid-19th century, as it has continued to do in our own time. Albert Brisbane, one of the great intellectuals of the Fourierite group, evinced considerable admiration for the French anarchist Proudhon, at one time declaring that he was the beginner of quote-unquote modern socialism. Rodelia Brisbane wrote that in, I guess, a book called Albert Brisbane that you can be found on page 292 and 294. The continuing expansion of the definition of socialism in the present time can be seen, for example, in James Burnham's The Managerial Revolution, published New York, 1941, in chapters 9, 14, and 15, and Lawrence Dennis's The Dynamics of War and Revolution, published New York, 1940, I guess, in the introduction from pages 20 to 31. So, see introduction, note 1. So, from the point of view of anarchists, the significance of Considerant as a propagandist in the socialist cause has been singularly overlooked. So there's a bunch of footnotes here that you can read up on, and I really encourage you to do so, because it's correct. Socialism meant many different things back then, and I'm not a proponent of socialism, but this is important history, so we'll continue with the reading now. So Josiah Warren, a keen student of Fourierism, found it objectionable on a number of counts: joint stock capitalization, community of property arrangements, reliance on altruism as the source of motivation for the performance of the distasteful tasks of the group. These and the dilution of responsibility, on which he placed much blame for the reduction of the New Harmony community of equality, were his principal indictments of the socialist phalansteries. I don't know how to pronounce that word. I do pre-read these, by the way, just for the record. I do pre-read this, but some of these words, like, I just can't get my head around. If you want a professional reading of this, go someplace else. But I love you guys. Thanks for being here. Convinced that this furious activity was a mistake, Warren determined to wait out its complete dissipation in New Harmony. But other factors intervened. Attempts to obtain land for a new village had been made in the vicinity of Cincinnati during the early part of 1847, without definite results. Other independent actions being equally indecisive, the opportunity came once more for the termination of a rival enterprise, as the Tuscarawas community had grown from the remnants of Spring Hill previously. In November of the previous year, the Claremont Phalanx, one of the largest and most promising of the Fourierite settlements, which had been located about 30 miles up the Ohio from Cincinnati, suddenly collapsed. As often happened in other similar cases, the land and property of the group fell into the hands of the principal stockholders. Most of the members of the Phalanx returned to Cincinnati, where the whole project had been born, but a sufficient number of enthusiasts remained to preserve hope in the eventual success of some type of community life. Much of the land was bought by a communal group led by 3 veterans in settlements of this nature: John O. Wattles, John P. Cornell, and Hiram S. Gilmore, who began the construction along Owenite lines, a community building partially inspired by the several similar structures of Rapite origin in New Harmony and intended for the accommodation of 6 families, was built on the site of the former location. But the attempt did not prosper. A small number of the earlier group also persevered, living on a piece of communally held land, where they were visited by Warren in June 1847, while occupied in discussions as to future action. If he had acquired a measure of recognition as an inventor, the individualist was even better known among community people, no less among those who expressed distaste for his theories. The Fourierites spoke of him as, quote, a man of no ordinary talents, end quote, and the success of his practical experimentation had given him the reputation of being a man of action as well as a theoretician. Warren was successful in prevailing upon the Phalansterians to take up the cost-price individualist variety decentralization. Okay, the cost-price individualist variety of decentralization. Shortly thereafter, the second essay in anarchist community life, variously known as Utopia and Trialville, was begun on a tract of land on the bank of the Ohio River about a mile from the site of the Claremont Phalanx. The labor exchange ideal prevailed from the beginning. The owner of the land, an ex-member of the previous group named Jernigan, was induced to set aside a portion for a town site. Streets and alleys were surveyed and laid out, while 80 quarter-acre lots for home building constituted the initial physical extent of the projected new community. These lots were placed on sale to prospective settlers at a fixed price of $15 each, which included the cost of the surveying. A contract calling for the constitution of this price policy until all lots were sold and lasting for at least 3 years in event of any circumstances was signed at this time. Purchasers were restricted by agreement to not more than 2 lots. Renewals of the price agreement were made periodically. Warren reporting after a visit to the village 9 years after its commencement that lots were still being sold to new settlers at quote-unquote prime cost. Admissions to the colony after the first gathering were made upon invitation by one of the first residents, in accordance with Warren's declaration that the most precious element of personal liberty was, quote, the liberty to choose our associates at all times, end quote. It was hoped that in this manner the intrusion of quote-unquote disturbers would be checked, and that persons impelled, quote, to inculcate any particular beliefs or isms of any kind against the voluntary inclination of others would find themselves disagreeably situated, end quote. Warren made a distinction between troublemakers and holders of divergent opinions, since conformity was neither expected nor desired. Quote, differences are a valuable part of our harmony, end quote. This attempt to filter out proponents of other ideas than equitable commerce, relatively successful at quote-unquote utopia, was to break down completely at quote-unquote modern times 10 years later. There, the efforts of varied reform protagonists all but scuttled the economic experiments. 4 families became the original core of the new town and were able, by exchanging labor, to build satisfactory homes, quote-unquote, before Christmas. An associate of Warren's, Daniel Prescott, began the construction of a brick kiln and yard, while some building stone was cut in the vicinity and lumber cut and carried to the building site. The small knot of disillusioned and nearly impoverished Fourierites who composed the group found themselves in far better economic position upon taking stock late the following spring. Nearly 24 families occupied the site, most of whom were already living in their own houses. Warren noted that no one had moved away since the beginning. Prescott had taken the initiative in constructing a saw and a grist mill, while Warren developed a quote-unquote printing office in a portion of the former's large brick house and began printing The Peaceful Revolutionist once more. The first issue of the paper contained detailed accounts of the cost in money and labor which attended the first 10 months of construction, and letters from enthusiastic settlers describing their satisfaction with affairs up to that time. So wrote E.G. Cubberley. Cubberley writes, I was in the Claremont Phalanx nearly 3 years, and paid in $207, and worked hard all the time, with not the best of eatable either. Eatables, eater. Ugh. And at the end of the time, I found myself rather badly situated. No money, no good clothes, no tools to commence work with, no anything. Last July, when Mr. Jernigan had this town laid out, I thought I would buy a lot and be gathering materials through the winter for building on it in the spring. On enquiry of those who had the brick, lumber, etc., I found I could exchange my labor for theirs. I have now got a brick house, 1 story and a half high, 16 by 18 feet. I borrowed $26 to commence my business with, and paid all that and had $30 left. I now have a house and a lot, and all I owe on it is $2.79 in money and about 4 days' labor. I feel now that I am a whole individual, not a piece of a mass or of somebody else, as I was in combination. The jack of all trades role was promoted among the settlers, with the desire being to create and develop all the needed skills among the residents that quote unquote heads and hands might be employed, quote, according to the demand, end quote. When the need for a particular skill temporarily ceased, Warren maintained it was, quote unquote, absolutely necessary that persons thus trained to seek, quote, full employment, end quote, in other ways. Quote, he is 10 times a citizen who can perform a citizen's part in 10 different positions. And more than this, when he is ready and willing to teach others to be as useful as himself, end quote. This is interesting stuff because it's like, it's exactly what we need today. Like, you know, I mean, a jack of all trades is a master of none, but you can certainly get a lot done. And if you have a lot of jack of all trades going on, you know, concentrated, then even more can get done. To continue, the labor note currency was adopted, and a time store selling basic merchandise at the usual drastically reduced prices found the same support from its patrons and aroused the customary resentment among merchants. Warren began his music training school once more on the labor exchange basis, with no conventional currency transactions, and with children as young as 9 years of age participating. His summary of the prevailing situation at quote-unquote Utopia in the spring of 1848 is a recital of material and spiritual gains which would have gladdened the heart of any individual anarchist half a century later. Throughout the whole of our operations on the ground, everything has been conducted so nearly upon the individual basis that not one meeting for legislation has taken place. No organization, no indefinite delegated power, no constitutions, no laws, or bylaws, rules, or regulations, but such as each individual makes for himself in his own business. No officers, no priests, nor prophets have been resorted to. Nothing of either kind has been in demand. We have had a few meetings, but they were for friendly conversation, for music, dancing, or some other social and pleasant pastime. Not even a single lecture upon the principles upon which we were acting has been given on the premises. It was not necessary, for, as a lady remarked yesterday, she said, the subject once stated and understood, there is nothing left to talk about. All is action after that. So that was Warren's summary. Warren went on to say that rights of person and property prevailing in the community existed by grace of and were defined by public opinion. In essence, a reaffirmation of his belief in the superiority of common law over statute law as a guide for human affairs. Judgments on what he termed mere differences of opinion and all other relationships were left to quote-unquote the supreme decisions of each individual. Operating under the understanding that responsibility or quote-unquote cost was an integral part of any act on the part of mature individuals. Failure to assume responsibility for acts placed the person in the same category as minor children, but nothing was said as to how such delinquency was dealt with at Utopia. Utopia not only was a community without a formal government, it also persevered without the presence of a patriarch and escaped the general fate which fell to those whose fortunes were inextricably interwoven with those of a dominant leader. Sensitive to criticism and troubled at this time by discussions elsewhere as to the credit for originality of the principles of equitable commerce, it became Warren's conviction that his personality stood in the way of the growth of the movement. Shortly before leaving Utopia, he declared, quote, I have 1,000 times felt that if this subject had originated with someone who was dead, I could have done perhaps 1,000 times more for it, end quote. Restless as ever, he left when the venture was hardly more than a year old, placing the little band of pioneers in anarchist decentralism entirely upon their own devices. The spirit of Warrenism remained there for a quarter of a century, however, In 1849, Amos E. Center published a second edition of his Equitable Commerce on the grounds. And by the end of the following year, most of Warren's economic teachings had become part of the life of the gathering of individualists. The residents of Utopia wasted no time in fruitless wrangling over differences of opinion connected with Warren's cost economy. Where critics aimed such shafts as the impossibility of determining the absolute accuracy of the labor hour as a medium of exchange, a small group of adherents preferred to work out a practical compromise. By the end of 1851, including the 3 other experiments where the mutual labor exchange had been introduced, several thousand people had participated. 2 contemporary observations summarizing the results of this varied interchange of labor notes give some evidence of the degree of advancement toward a realization of their objective. When the decision was made to adopt corn as a medium of exchange at the rate of 20 pounds to the hour as an alternative to supplying the actual labor, a suspicion set in that disorder would result due to widely fluctuating extremes. An examination of the labor notes indicated that the variation from the 20-pound yardstick was a third above or below this figure, reflecting changing costs of production which were expected to alter all labor notes payable only in hours of labor as well. In a number of other aspects of economic life at Utopia, several products found the quote-unquote general level, which Warren claimed earlier would occur as a result of the action of quote-unquote public opinion. It was more likely that the determining factor was the existing pattern of technical learning at the stage of machine production which the colony tended to become adapted to. The labor exchange as it worked here is quite illuminating, nevertheless. With respect to agricultural products, the customary price for wheat became 6 hours to the bushel, milk settled to 10 minutes per quart, while eggs remained undisturbed at 20 minutes a dozen. Some manufactured goods also became quote-unquote fixed. Shoes varied from 3 to 9 hours, depending on the quality, with 18 hours the figure for boots. Still, it was expected that the labor price would always be subject to change as new production methods were introduced, with the expectation that such changes would work for the increase of the volume of goods per hour of time expended in production, a gain for everyone in the community. There was a choice for the producer as well, however, in all this. The individual might choose increased prosperity for increased work, or a shortened workday if he had more modest material ambitions. In either case, the decision was to be made with the understanding that the consequences were to be borne by the individual concerned. The community at Utopia never became a large or prominent one at any time. In 1852, the total number of residents approached 100. Approximately 20 families were established on the grounds, and this situation remained practically unchanged during the next 2 years. By the winter of 1854, few of the original lots remained for sale to new settlers. The activities of the residents by this time had become more and more industrial in nature. The mutualists operated several enterprises on the labor-for-labor basis, including a saw and grist mill, a steam mill adapted to a number of services, including corn grinding and the turning of both wood and iron products, as well as a carpenter shop. Most of the machinery in this latter building was power-driven. The modest needs of the inhabitants found room for the services of 3 carpenters, 2 shoemakers, a glazier, and a painter, while, despite the limited opportunity to practice the cost economy, enough vigor in the system prevailed to support 2 time stores. Warren considered Utopia a successful demonstration of all he had been asserting since his defection from Owenite socialism. In view of his later disappointments, this Ohio village was without doubt the outstanding example of decentralist social and economic principles in actual operating situations. His last visit in the winter of 1855 through 56 was the occasion for an enthusiastic report to the public concerning its perseverance. Utopia, by this time, consisted of some 40 buildings, about half of which were devoted to industrial purposes. Optimism radiated in the estimate of the accomplishments there. Warren writes, "My visit to that little germ of equitable society, now 8.5 years old, has given me higher hopes and expectations than I had before dared to entertain. It is not the display that the little group of buildings makes to the eye, but knowing the means by which these have been acquired, and seeing that there the subject of equity has had 8 years and 6 months deep study and practical trial, and that from the beginning the subject had lost nothing with those who first took hold of it, but had gained from year to year in their highest judgment and affectionate regard." The major energies of Warren and his associates had swung to the east by this time, however, where the more pretentious and less successful Modern Times was entering a critical period of its varying fortunes. Thus, at the time the report of the success at Utopia was being made, the Ohio group was already becoming less and less prominent in the eyes of the other individualists, and practically disappeared from the thoughts and literature of the articulate individualist anarchist propaganda in the later generation. The impact of the Civil War and cheap lands westward had serious consequences for the little adventure in mutualism, as well as the prevailing policy of modesty with reference to publicity, which had a discouraging effect upon recruitment of additional settlers and potential converts. It is true that the experimental nature of Utopia precluded indiscriminate outside participation in its activities, a matter brought about by continual fear of widespread censure by moralists for harboring persons whose behavior might have been considered excessively unconventional. In view of the apprehension of the general conservative mind, especially concerning divergence in matters of thought and action of sexual nature, the policy of allowing the first settlers to choose subsequent permanent residence was undoubtedly a wise one. As late as 1875, a few of the original settlers still occupied portions of the area, which by now had become known as Smith's Landing. Occasional reports indicated that some of the business transacted by residents continued to be done on the labor exchange principle, and that despite the serious depression then prevailing in the nation at large, labor notes based on corn continued to be honored with little fluctuation from the first estimates made almost 30 years before. Utopia, in the more correct sense, however, had ceased being of significance in American social life at least a decade before. When approached from the point of view of Josiah Warren, who conceived the venture as proving ground for principles and not as an attempt to revolutionize American civilization, it was a qualified success. In a reminiscence made 8 months before his death, he declared that the experiment, quote, unquote, worked to our satisfaction. It is in this matter of intention that the anarchist community differed from its allied and contemporary so-called utopian schemes. Permanent survival at no time constituted a basic objective, at least as far as the settlements in question were concerned. Warren nevertheless experienced a disappointment which was common among the reformers of mid-19th century America. The faith in mere demonstration as a force sufficiently compelling to attract numerous followers can be found throughout the varied hues of the movement, accompanied by almost universal eventual rejection or unconcern. Warren's fond hope of numerous imitations of Utopia likewise foundered, but not until the experiences of community life had been extended by the promise and dampened by the factionalism at modern times. In the summer of 1848, Warren returned to Boston after an absence of almost 30 years. Such a move was no indication that he had given up the Midwest as a field for further propaganda and experimentation. In fact, He was back in New Harmony less than 2 years later. It is probable that the intellectual stimulation provided by contact with many radical minds in the East, however, had much to do with the decision to combine efforts with friends and once more prepare for action on a project first proposed by Francis Wright and Robert Dale Owen in 1830, an individualist colony in the vicinity of New York City. In Boston, he became acquainted with William B. Greene, whose own branch of economic thought later became incorporated in anarchist financial theory. Association with the free thought movement provided occasions for lectures on equitable commerce to gatherings of this group, which contained diverse liberal and radical elements. It is probable that here he also developed his association with Stephen Pearl Andrews. Andrews, a prominent New York intellectual and veteran of several reform movements, became Warren's first important convert in the advocacy of decentralism and individualism. It was also in New York that Warren developed to a high degree his reputation as a lecturer before small groups of interested listeners, who gathered together for this purpose in the homes of members of varied reform proclivities. At about the time Warren became acquainted with Andrews, he also began relations with Charles Coffin Jewett, who had been appointed the librarian of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, and who was looking for a satisfactory printing process to print the institution's first centralized catalog of books. His search led him to Warren, and the two men worked together for some time before Jewett decided to employ Warren's stereotyping process. While this was going on, Warren was still interested in the Mutual Village in Ohio, and in doubt as to whether he should return. And at the same time was speaking frequently around Boston, discussing with Andrews the possibility of another colony on Long Island, and making trips to Washington to confer with Jewett. It was, indeed, a very busy time for Warren. From the fall of 1850 into the spring of 1851, Warren described the technical progress of his process in his correspondence to Andrews and his cordial relations with Jewett. The two apparently shared considerable mutual respect and affection. Quote, Mr. Jewett is delighted with the very first results here, end quote, he wrote Andrews early in October. And subsequent cheerful dispatches from Boston or Washington culminated with the triumphant announcement in mid-March 1851 that Jewett was perfectly delighted with the application of the process to his cataloging project, followed by the heartwarming news on April 1st that a committee set up by the Smithsonian had investigated his printing process, quote unquote, most severely and reported, quote, unqualifiedly in its favor, and had advised purchase for the institution, end quote. It was indeed a day of high joy for Josiah Warren. An explanation of the strategy which resulted in the decision to form an individualist colony on Long Island was never made, although three important circumstances have significant bearing on the matter. Andrews's contacts in New York and his wide association with many varieties of radical thought in and around the city undoubtedly made possible a ready dissemination of information as well as details for the recruitments of persons interested in colonization. Secondly, it had long been a contention of Warren's that origins of decentralist colony along his lines should always be made near a large city, with the unabashed intention of using the older community as a prop until the economy of the new community was a functioning reality. Finally, Warren's acquaintance with prominent land reformers in New York, as well as knowledge of their literature, had helped to reveal to him a usually ignored fact. The rush of the land-hungry to the new areas of Iowa and Minnesota now and then bypassed pockets of relatively inaccessible soil which the railroad subsequently opened up. In general, there were few who were sufficiently impressed or possessed with sufficient powers of deduction to take advantage of opportunities of this kind. And Long Island was one of them, an incident which followed this expansion of transportation. Opened up by the belated building of Long Island Railroad, some 500,000 acres of land became available for occupation and use in the 1840s. But a general movement upon it did not take place. The character of portions of it was distinctly inhibitory. Thick growths of scrub oak and jack pine made the land costly to clear. And the sandy loam was considered unproductive unless treated with considerable applications of manure and other types of fertilizer. On the other hand, there were those who presented factors in its favor from an agricultural point of view. Farm experts already settled on parts of the island declared that although these objections might be true, the land produced amply in the proximity of the New York market made an investment in land here more desirable economically than in the newly opened areas of the Trans-Mississippi country. Few agreed with them on any account, and as a result, an unopened country, relatively speaking, remained at the door of the nation's largest city. With such circumstances prevailing, the impulse behind the beginning of quote-unquote modern times becomes a little better understood. By the end of 1850, Warren and Andrews had worked out their plans and strategy, and practical operations were just a step away. Warren himself was on the scene in January 1851 with a handful of the first members. Andrews remaining in New York to complete arrangements with the owners of the land upon which the individualists were to found their town. Warren had not overlooked Andrews' value as a propagandist in the cause. The latter's writings and lectures became a primary source of information to the outside as to the aims and accomplishments of the Long Island group. Modern Times commenced, according to Warren, on March 21st, 1851. The site of the rudimental town was on a tract of 750 acres of land about 4 miles from the ocean on the south side of the island and about 40 miles out from the city of New York. A factor of considerable influence in the choice of this particular site, according to Charles A. Codman, later to become the last survivor of the original community people, was the fact that the owners were willing to accept a very small cash down payment and a 5-year bond for the balance due. This extension of payment was a matter of great concern in view of the lack of capital. About 90 acres of this area was set aside for the town itself, which was laid out in 49 blocks. The town consisted of 7 streets running north and south and 7 avenues running east and west, with right-angle intersections. The blocks were divided into 4 lots each, with a frontage of 200 feet, and each block had an alley running only in the north-south direction. In the center of each of these alleys was a well. The alleys were common property in the beginning, and this matter rose to plague the residents of a somewhat later time, since there was no ostensible manner of obtaining title to this land. Through involved legal proceedings, however, the alleys were attached to the lots and no longer exist. As had before been arranged at Utopia, a contract was secured providing that all land would be sold to individual settlers at cost, the acre lot selling for approximately $20. 3 acres was the maximum holding which any person might purchase in the town. Warren had in mind an equitable village of 1,000 persons possessing a wide variety of occupations, not a purely agricultural community. For this reason, ownership in the town itself was restricted, although those interested in farming had access to the remaining land on the on the periphery of the town, which sold for the same price. Modern Times was a hand-picked congregation at the beginning. A policy of expendiency was adopted, which allowed the first 10 purchasers of land to screen later buyers, who had to be acceptable to one of these 10 before being admitted to the group. Similar to the policy in effect at Utopia, both Warren and Andrews admitted that this and other actions were violations of the principles which they advocated, but justified this as a protection against the acquisition of vital areas by persons who might be either indifferent or hostile to the cost economy experiment. They felt that vetting was a betrayal of their principles, but they decided to go with it to protect their community. Interesting. This policy was gradually abandoned, as friends rather than enemies were to furnish the distressing occasions in later years and eventually contribute to the abandonment of most of the desired goals. Even in the early months, however, it was stressed that individual responsibility was the foundation upon which they were building, and that it was up to each person to satisfy himself as to what type of organization he sought to create. At no time were potential settlers or interested persons discouraged from learning what was being attempted on the grounds. Andrews said, "We recommend all those who are desirous of removal to an equitable village first to visit it and remain long enough to form the personal acquaintance of those who are already here or already there, to penetrate thoroughly their designs, the spirit by which they are imbued, and the extent of their moral and material means of accomplishing what they propose." The earliest residents engaged in a variety of endeavors during the first year. Small houses, generally log cabins, began to be erected, with the usual separation of money and labor costs. Daniel D. Tompkins Moore, founder and the editor of the Rural New Yorker, described the soil of Brentwood, the later name of the town site and the extended community which exists there today, as a fine, genial brown loam, very similar to the market garden lands of England, and later experience was to prove its productivity. In the beginning, appearances were far less promising. Outside help was utilized to aid in clearing and plowing land intended for agriculture, which proved somewhat costly in most cases. Removal of scrub growth and roots generally cost $30 an acre. Most of the woody materials, amounting to from 20 to 30 cords per acre, were burned and reapplied to the soil, a type of dressing which was highly esteemed. Agricultural land further required some $40 worth of fertilizer per acre. Land being thus prepared, yielding surprising crops of several varieties of garden truck, which was later marketed in the city. This was facilitated by the fact that Thompson's station, the stop on the railroad, was a short distance north of the village. Warren himself engaged in the building activities, erecting a house at a total money cost of $120, which he later sold for the same sum. Building costs were appreciably lowered by another of his inventions, a method of making bricks from the gravel and lime of the area and hardening these by drying in the sun. By the end of the first year, he had almost completed a combination workshop and apprentice school, which was known as the college. Known as the college, a brick structure 32 feet square, 2 stories high. The lower floor was devoted to a time store and shops. The upper and the attic were devoted to ordinary dwelling space. By the middle of 1853, modern times had become physically attractive. Most of the land on the town site had been cleared and the original log cabins replaced by well-constructed cottages. The streets were beginning to be lined with shade and fruit trees, and the discovery of soft water of fine quality at depths from 30 to 40 feet proved to be another distinct advantage. Building on the labor exchange principle was a pursuit of nearly all the men. Some 60 persons now occupied the premises, a meager number still, when compared with Warren's expectations, yet this represented an increase almost triple that of 10 months previous. The townsmen were quite frank in admitting that they had by no means perfected their economic institution. Some residents practiced trades and supplied services which were in little demand, with the result that they were forced to work for wages in New York. The group failed as well in their immediate achievement of self-reliance for all material needs, some of which were of necessity procured in the city. In spite of adversities, adversaries, faith in the soundness of their economic and social conceptions abounded. Confident that numbers sufficient to provide demand for the labor of all would arrive soon, preparations for the construction of a labor exchange were arranged much similar to that which had existed as an accompaniment to the first Cincinnati time store. Still more important was the general morale prevailing. A visitor and subsequent member reported, quote, "The movement does inspire its votaries here with a confidence and zeal that cannot be surpassed," end quote. While the practical operations were being conducted at modern times, the propaganda of Warrenite anarchist economic and social doctrines, directed by Andrews in New York, flared brilliantly, with repercussions from several directions. At about the time that preparations were being made to move out of the site selected for the demonstration of individual sovereignty, Andrews formed an association with the Fowlers and Wells Company, a firm of book publishers specializing in the writings of several fragments of the radical movement of the time. Although their particular interest lay in phrenology and spiritualism, the Fowler brothers undertook the dissemination of a series of modest volumes which brought the core of Native American anarchist thought before a sizable cross-section of the nation's reading public. In 1851, Andrews's Science of Society series first appeared. The next year, a second edition of this was accompanied by a third edition of Warren's Equitable Commerce, which Andrews admitted as the source of his ideas. As a companion of the theoretical works, Fowler's brought out Warren's early experiences in a volume titled Practical Details in Equitable Commerce. Two editions being printed from the same plates in 1852 and again in 1854. The reprinting of Equitable Commerce was the signal for the reopening of the controversy with the highly articulate group of Fourierites now centered in New York around Horace Greeley, Charles Dana, and the New York Tribune. This was the last important stand of associationist socialism, both in theory and practice. The North American phalanx and nearby New Jersey being their last community in sound condition. From this time on, the Modern Times colony was to get little support and less peace from the metropolitan area, primarily as a result of the searchlight which was to be turned upon it by the Tribune. A disparaging 3.5-column review of Equitable Commerce, generally attributed to George Ripley, erstwhile president of the Brook Farm Association, broke out in the pages of the Tribune in the summer of 1852. Andrews attempted to soften its impact with a 2-column letter to the editor in rebuttal, but Warren personally was apathetic. In a letter to Andrews in July of the same year, he said, "You know, I have long ago ceased to hope for anything from editors or any others who have any particular position or isms to sustain. The great point is to inform the public what we really mean before leaders get a chance to misrepresent our views and movements." In actuality, criticism by exponents of Fourierism was a minor item as an element of detraction. Modern Times, like Brook Farm a few years earlier, was beginning to attract visitors possessed with an insatiable curiosity as to the social life of the new model town. The Warrenite conception of individuality had no room for restrictions upon the religious or moral beliefs and practices of the residents any more than upon any aspects of their existence. Compliance with religious and marital customs and regulations was a voluntary matter. The lack of coercion and the fastening of responsibility for all behavior upon the individual created an area of free movement invigorating to the residents and a source of consternation to those outside possessing more straight-laced convictions. Complete respect for individual peculiarities also served to attract eccentrics or rebels at convention. And in the case of enlightened ladies in the habit of wearing bloomers or men's clothing, created a sensational focus for scandal for outsiders. Modern Times, as Warren conceived it, did not abolish restraints, which the outside considered essential to social well-being. It merely failed to recognize that an element of restriction was necessary in an environment where it was assumed that freedom of action should have no limitation beyond the refraining from infringement upon rights of others to do the same. Right? The assumption of responsibility, the avoidance of the inflicting of the consequences of one's acts upon others, was felt sufficient as a principle of social behavior. It is not surprising, then, to observe the attack upon Modern Times as a center of sexual irregularity, among other things. Although unfounded, such charges did have validity when reviewed as a reflection of the moral concepts of a period dominated by lip service to puritanical codes of sexual deportment. The whispering campaigns of critical observers and gossips, aided by a barrage of innuendo furnished by the New York newspapers, finally forced the residents into an act of self-defense. In September of 1852, Warren addressed a circular to the general public, which all the adult citizens in the colony signed. In it, he developed the case for the individualists, hoping to allay the suspicions of the righteous and at the same time demonstrate to potential friends the real nature of the activities on Long Island and deflate the collection of disturbing rumors in existence. Concern over the tendency of visitors and others to look upon the assemblage as a secret cult due to their reticence and aversion toward publicity, Warren hastened to inform all that no society or organization existed, nor did the residents have a rigid corporate structure which arbitrarily restricted membership. Reaffirming the belief in the soundness of the policy of absolute individual responsibility for opinions and conduct, as well as the economic experiments being made, he appealed to outsiders to base their judgments upon accurate, reliable reports and not hearsay, in which category he placed most of the press notices. In like manner, this has got me thinking of, like, even today, you start talking about these principles and things to people, and sometimes you get accused of being in a cult. It's kind of, similarities are kind of striking. It's kind of making me laugh. In like manner, he deprecated the destructive rumors, quote, by those whose object it is to ride high upon any hobby, even at the expense of other people, end quote, seeking to, quote unquote, ruin what they cannot rule. Suggesting the reading of recent published books explaining the philosophy of individual sovereignty rather than relying on ignorance and prejudice, he protested in the name of the city of modern times. He cannot, quote, we cannot consent to have our time consumed and our peace continually disturbed in refuting ignorant, vile, and ridiculous fabrications, end quote. The continued association of Warren's name. So Warren wrote that on behalf of the city of modern times. The continued association of Warren's name with imagined and real social irregularities provoked the publication of Positions Defined in August of the following year. Warren denied that the equity movement was necessarily characterized by unusual freedom in marriage relations, insisting that individual sovereignty was as valid with respect to retaining the conventional association as it was for advocating radical departures. Angered at being erroneously quoted, Warren, in this leaflet, publicly disavowed his connection with any speaker or paper purporting to represent him unless sanction was specifically given. All efforts to continue developing in the pleasant obscurity which attended the sister settlement in Ohio went to naught. Nevertheless, as the tendency for modern times to act as a magnet for unpopular and exotic beliefs continued to strengthen. Particularly damaging from the point of view of adverse public opinion was the temporary concentration there of the semi-mystical creed of spiritual affinity under the leadership of Dr. Thomas L. Nichols, combining portions of spiritualism, socialism, and what was later to be known as women's rights. Nichols' doctrine had been, by this time, acquired the label, quote-unquote, free love, among most of those outside who were acquainted with it. The advocacy of a general loosening of marriage ties and a greater freedom for women in all matters relating to the institution, despite its idealistic foundation, provoked a violent reaction in the newspapers and from the clergymen. Oh my God! The women, they're doing things without our permission. Oh no. Oh no. Nichols' appearance at Modern Times in 1853 had been preceded by the publication there a year before of a modest journal titled The Art of Living. Hold on 1 second. The free love movement started in the frickin' 1850s. All right. Seriously. 1850s or 1950s? We're in the 1850s here. Okay? That's incredible. It's incredible. Anyways, moving on. Nichols' appearance at Modern Times in 1853 had been preceded by the publication there a year before of a modest journal titled The Art of Living, which presented the case of the vanguard in the struggle for a greater degree of female social and economic equality. Spiritual affinity aroused little concern among the practical people of modern times, many of whom had arrived at similar ideas and were already living them without a propaganda of literature. But Nichols and his close associates had pronounced influence in the city. What hope existed that the potential trouble would quietly subside evaporated when Andrews became involved in a three-cornered controversy with Horace Greeley and Henry James, dealing with the aspects of love, marriage, and divorce, which were considered extremely delicate by segments of majority public opinion. Thereafter, for the duration of its existence and well into the period when Modern Times had become Brentwood, the place became synonymous with scandalous behavior, as well as suspected hotbed of licentiousness, a state of mind which Andrews' lengthy communications in the Tribune tended to make permanent. The removal of Nichols to Cincinnati a year later had little effect in reducing apprehension. A potential colonist writing from Connecticut queried as to the system prevailing at Modern Times. That person wrote, I guess his name is DeWitt Upson. Okay, DeWitt Upson writes to Josiah Warren, "Is it intended that families live together similarly as in the monogamic system or in large house contemplated by communists, or in isolation and alone by himself or herself?" Having of late been brought in contact with the writings of Mr. and Mrs. Nichols through their journal, in which I find many things to approve and not any really to condemn, although I may not as yet be able to sanction them, and from his interest in the village presume that the principles there practiced or intended to be practiced there to be in unison with his. Thus, continue. Thus there existed considerable confusion and misunderstanding concerning the Warrenite town. Not only was there a belief that social chaos reigned, but among its friends, there was no general agreement as to its essential nature, with estimates ranging all the way from a community of property to a mere collection of hermits and recluses. Not many more than the 50 or so families actually residing there seemed to be aware of the voluntary cooperative community originally contemplated. Warren, no radical on the marriage question, deplored Nichols and the mixing of the labor and marriage reforms. He later blamed the whole matter as the cause of most of the trouble experienced and the principal reason why modern times failed to continue growing after the first 3 years. The quote-unquote ogre, as he labeled the free love movement, confronted nearly every social reform movement from Robert Owen's time onward, in one form or another, threatening a complete split in the intellectual anarchist camp 20 years after modern times. The defection of Nichols and the withdrawal of Andrews from the ranks of the active propagandists neither brought the season of problems to an end, nor did it result in a decrease in the volume of intellectual sorties in the Long Island social laboratory. Notable among these was the bitter attack by Aidan Ballou, the New Testament fundamentalist patriarch of Hopedale community in Massachusetts. Hopedale, entering a period of declining fortunes which was to end in bankruptcy in February 1856, combined a paternalistic religious atmosphere dominated by Ballou and an economy embodying some aspects of socialism, but in actuality controlled by a minority group of stockholders, into whose hands the colony eventually fell. Ballou's attention first became directed toward modern times following the desertion of several of his own group to the Warrenite settlement in 1853, as a result of the influence of the doctrines of Nichols. Ballou's Practical Christian Socialism, published the next year, incorporated a severe castigation of Warren and the entire philosophy of individual sovereignty. Recognizing its position apart from the teachings of Owen, Fourier, and John Humphrey Noyce, the Hopedale sage indicated it as, quote, an irreligious, immoral, and licentious doctrine, end quote, deploring its non-committal stand on religion and its virtual rejection of belief in God by virtue of its uncompromising stand in placing the individual person at the apex of their system. Scandalized by the report that marriage as an institution was subject to constant criticism and that residents of modern times entered the married state with neither the legal nor ecclesiastical sanctions normally obtained, Ballou launched an attack on such behavior as free love promiscuity, repeating for the most part the familiar misconceptions which the uninformed everywhere were propagating. Warren took little notice of Ballou's criticisms of either the social or economic basis of modern times, although a Tribune article by the former stung him into an objection to the stress upon religious dogmatism and Christianity. Ballou intensely contested that the Warren insistence upon the right to the full product of labor by the producer, but his alternative Warren found eminently unsatisfactory. He writes, I decline any controversy with a man who is satisfied with the word reasonable as a standard of measurement in a disputed subject, as I would object to purchasing cloth of a merchant who used a gum elastic yardstick. Sick burn, bro. If Warren objected to the conversion of what primarily had been intended as an experiment in cost economy into an experimental station for sexual autonomy, he resented as markedly an undermining of the colony itself by Henry Edgar, an early enthusiast and member. An Englishman by birth, Edgar came to the United States in 1851 with the intention of joining Etienne Cabot's well-known colony in Icaria in Illinois. An early reading of Stephen Pearl Andrews' Science of Society resulted in the transfer of his attachment to the individualist school. Andrews, he continued to regard the progenitor of the movement, although it is impossible that the latter spent more than brief moments there after the community became established. Edgar's decision to become a member of the group was not made until the summer of 1853. Abandoning the profession of law, having been a barrister in London, he moved to modern times and made a living as a nurseryman for the duration of his stay of over 25 years. Nurseryman. Fireman. No, I'm just kidding. Nurseryman. What's a nurseryman do? Affection for equitist principles had a brief sway, his energies the following year being taken up by the propagation of the philosophy of Auguste Comte, with whom he soon established a correspondence. His life thereafter became a dedication to Comtean positivism, of which he was the first exponent in the United States. The religious aspect of positivism, the real concern of Comte as far as relations with Edgar and modern times were concerned, appeared to other inhabitants as hardly more than a blunt reaction erected on a foundation of authoritarianism. As the religion of humanity, its principal objective appeared to be to them a frontal attack on individualism, attempting to substitute for the doctrine of self-interest an altruistic love of humanity in the mass. Its curious mixture of virgin and ancestor worship and obsession with authoritarian solutions had practically no appeal during the period it was propagated most vigorously in modern times. Nor did its proposed restoration of a social matriarchy and introduction of a paternalistic economic system, which faintly reflected attitudes which gained articulation later in the century in the celebrated Gospel of Wealth. To anarchists of a later generation who were among the first to examine the correspondence of Comte to Edgar, much of the contents seemed hardly credible, especially the plan to convert modern times into a positivist town and Long Island into a separate state in the Union. In the hopes of conditioning the minds of the residents for the acceptance of the religious and economic centralized hierarchy which constituted the Comtean social system, Edgar began a vigorous attack upon the very basis of the town, and fought its individualist and decentralist aspects. Professing to abhor the individual sovereignty doctrine now, he did not hesitate to admit that he planned to take advantage of the protection it offered. He says, quote, "This little village where I live has, notwithstanding its preeminent anarchy, a powerful attraction for me. Here I meet at least with the widest tolerance." Now began his vigorous propaganda campaign aimed at its overthrow, so that completely contradictory tenets might thus be substituted. This is why it is important to vet people. Seriously. The establishment of a small positivist chapel and the printing and circulating in the fall of 1855 of a tract entitled Modern Times, The Labor Question and the Family, placed the positivist stand squarely before the inhabitants. The 10 principles formulated by Edgar included the substitution of duties for rights, unqualified adherence to monogamic monogamy, marriage, the development of a positivist priesthood, the insistence of the necessity of class differences, none of which found much acceptance among the original inhabitants. Particular residence was met with from the women, Edgar observed. Particular resistance, was met from the women. Maybe I should just untie my tongue real quick, undo the knot that it's in. Adherence to the particularly individualistic beliefs of spiritualism and women's rights partially accounted for this attitude. Edgar's disparagement of the labor exchange had some effect, but sizable portions of the town's economy functioned through the use of labor notes long after his effort to paralyze it had dissipated itself. One of Edgar's fond hopes was the expectation of aid in the form of philanthropy, confident that such help would be forthcoming from such rich men, from some rich man attracted by the opportunity of status to be realized in the coming community. Oh, that's embarrassing. But no man of wealth, intrigued by the possibility of becoming a member of the apex of Comte's future patriarch, Comte's future patriciate, or industrial chivalry, as it was termed, ever put in the anticipated appearance. Generally speaking, Edgar made practically no headway in the dissemination of positivism in or at modern times. In a letter to Comte, written in the early part of 1857, he reported disconsolately, "To confess the truth, it is the small sympathy I can find among the members of our own school that is my principal discouragement. What is all our philosophy, all our sociology, all our doctrine from beginning to end, in the absence of an actual constituted church and priesthood?" To this evidence of pessimism, including the admission of lack of believers, Comte had repeatedly rejoined with cautions against presumptions in such unusual circumstances. Comte says, "You attach too much importance to your abnormal surroundings at modern times. Even in the best environment, positivism can hope to convert only 1/1000th of the present generation. Conversions will be rare in your anarchical village. You should devote your attention above all to conservatives, who are the most likely converts to positivism." To Comte, Warren's philosophy of mutual cooperation on a basis of individual responsibility was primitive and backwards, advising that it was best ignored. He says, "You must not waste your time in publishing refutations of anarchical sophisms. Spend it rather in spreading positivisms by means of conversation." Despite Warren's anxiety, Modern Times remained adamant to Edgar's earnest proselytizing. The latter's personal journal listed the membership of the Positivist Society of Modern Times in 1859 at only 6 beyond the members of his own family. And only 4 of these actually resided on Long Island. His failure as a missionary did not affect his reputation, for he remained an esteemed citizen of the community for some time, during which he occasionally contributed articles on Comtean philosophy to liberal journals at irregular occasions. In one sense, it might be held that Edgar finally won out over Modern Times, but not in the manner in which he expected. When the people elected to change the name of the community during the Civil War to Brentwood, they honored this first disciple of Auguste Comte and his wife, both former residents of Brentwood, England. Modern Times in 1854 was a gathering of 37 families with a slow, gradual growth in numbers constantly being expected. Most of the productive activities centered around agricultural projects of one kind or another. A fruit tree nursery of considerable excellence was functioning, with another in contemplation. Truck gardening, primarily vegetables for the New York market, was the principal source of outside income, still of vital importance as the group had not grown large enough to provide for an economy entirely divorced from the money economy of the outside. One of the newer developments by the late summer of this year was a type of community dining hall, a prototype of the modern cafeteria, which was managed by Clark Orvis, who later became important in perfecting the velocipede. This new endeavor, known as the dining saloon, afforded different opportunities that had usually been the lot in community projects of this sort. The individualization of the menu, providing some outlet for the expression of individual tastes, was looked upon by members of previous community life. What happened? Okay. The individualization of the menu, providing some outlet for the expression of individual tastes, was looked upon by members of previous community life as a striking innovation, where they had been restricted to a common fare noted for its monotony, regardless of the intent in furthering the democratization of the group. In the same year, Warren began publication of his famous periodical letter, a monthly journal which explained the philosophy and activities of modern times. Though its circulation was small, it had surprising distribution, with subscribers throughout the country, as well as England and Ireland. For the next 4 years, it served not only to present the Long Island social experiment to interested liberals and radicals, but to provide Warren with a sounding board for the expression of his views on a wide variety of current topics and events of both national and international concern. The diplomatic incidents with Denmark and England, the know-nothings, constitutional interpretation, slavery, the bloodshed in Kansas, Fremont as a presidential candidate, all found interpretations from the incipient anarchist viewpoint. Warren, granting the moral issue involved in the slavery question, continued the non-committal stand which had been taken for decades by economic radicals, and which had been thoroughly expressed by George Henry Evans in an exchange with Gerrit Smith some time before. To men like Warren and Evans, chattel slavery was merely one side of a brutal situation, and although sympathetic with its opponents, refused to take part in the struggle unless it was extended to a wholesale attack on what they termed wage slavery in the states where Negro slavery no longer existed. Freedom was an abstract state which had little appeal if it merely meant grave economic distress where employers no longer cared for or needed the services of free labor, quote-unquote free labor. With reference to the looming war, Warren believed that conflict on such a scale was an inherent part of the underlying conditions attending the original, quote-unquote, association of the states. merely awaiting the proper occasion when an issue of sufficient gravity and concern would result in a rebellion of the minority upon pressure from the majority. Slavery might be the immediate issue, he argued, but the possibilities of others in the future were guaranteed by the preservation of the structure of the political system. He refused to take sides in the controversy, although he accused the South of inconsistency in the matter of threatened secession. If they asserted their right to secede as a matter of principle, then it followed that the slaves also had a right to secede, quote unquote, secede from their owners. Since both associations, the Union and the institution of slavery, were artificial arrangements now fastened together by the expedients of statute law. However, if war was to be fought to preserve the political organization, he could see in this action only a sacrifice of the people to their own creature, the organization. For, as Warren wrote, quote, "There has always been a perpetual contest between man and man-made institutions. And although their struggles have cost the world more than all other causes put together, experience and learning seem to teach nothing to any purpose. Institutionalism is still sacred in the eyes of most people, as juggernaut in the eyes of its blind devotees. So our civilization still continues in the midst of murder and confusion to invent and concoct institutions as substitutes for justice." End quote. That's from Periodical Letters 2, pages 53 through 54. Thus, until the eve of the war, Warren continued to use pages of the periodical letter to expound the anti-statist viewpoint, attacking political organization and the attendant evils, which he considered the results of the conflicts produced by the contest for control of its destinies. In espousing the unpopular doctrines of decentralist voluntary cooperation and the disinterestedness toward nationalism, the periodical letter preceded the 20th century publications of the anarchist press, which have persisted in presenting the same outlook with reference to modern problems, although the latter have operated in the face of suppression and persecution, which Warren never experienced. Although dismayed by the bad press which Modern Times received as a result of the activities of Nichols and Edgar, and tempted to give the whole venture up as a result of revived interest in his stereotyping inventions, which threatened to divert his attentions from the field of social reform entirely for a time, Warren remained attached to the little community. Following a brief trip to his home in New Harmony and a few months spent in Boston in the winter of 1855 through 56, he returned to Long Island and remained there until late in 1862. The spring of 1857 saw the arrival of new adherents, alleged secessionists from Brook Farm, who became known as the Boston Group. Among these were Charles A. Codman, Edward Linton, William U. Dame, and several others and their families, one of whom was reputed to have been a treasurer of the famous Massachusetts community. The Boston Group contained among its members those who were to be the most tenacious of the Modern Times residents. Modern Times, with its local currency, felt little of the shock of the Panic of 1857. Moncure Daniel Conway, a visitor there in the summer of this year, testified to the economic and social harmony prevailing among the less than 200 inhabitants. More impressed by the unusual dress of the women and other social novelties, notably the unconcern toward marriage ties and the absence of both a court or jail, Conway verified the operation of the cost economy and the use of the corn-backed labor note. At that time, he observed that there appeared to be no concern over such evils as overissue and counterfeiting. For a time, the labor notes exceeded the scope of their original intention. Used in transactions with citizens of neighboring towns, These notes became acceptable as payments for taxes for periods during the Depression following the Panic of this year. The outbreak of the Civil War presaged the end of the modern times experiment in some aspects and its modification in others. The first 2 years saw little change in the life of the village other than an expansion of the program of education. Warren advertised the beginning of an extensive training program in a number of trades and occupations, reflecting a continuation of the earlier stand he had taken against apprenticeships. The general public was invited to take part in the undertaking, although it appeared to be slanted toward attracting new residents, since much of the training offered favored trades and skills of especial advantage in the type of society which decentralism generally produced. The widespread interests included instruction in the playing of several musical instruments. Not much evidence exists that this ambitious program was ever put into action, or that the degree of expected participation was realized. The confusion, unrest, and apprehension created by the war began to have effect upon many of the original members of modern times. Aggravated by rumors of heavy taxes and military draft plans during the latter part of the year of 1862 and the first few months of the following year. Agitated by the violence and disruption which was becoming a part of the existence of many in all parts of the land, Warren published a curious tract called Modern Government and Its True Mission, A Few Words for the American Crisis, which advocated expedients greatly at variance with principles which have unalterable status among anarchists. A study of the work reveals a regression to functional aspects long taught by Robert Owen. In February of 1863, Warren went to Boston and never returned to modern times again. The same year, a number of original settlers embarked from the island, bound for more peaceful lands, but the colony persevered. Suspected of being a hotbed of vice in the post-war period, modern times preserved most of its community spirit through the era, although by the time the use of labor note had declined as the economy of New York became more pervading. Stalked by John B. Ellis in the hopes of uncovering there a nest of free love, responses to questions revealed little change in spirit in the 2 decades of existence. "We mind our own business," declared an old resident who was known as who? I don't know. Anyways, according to Ellis, the majority of people living in the village are legally married, but our people don't look on marriage as absolutely necessary. We still hold the doctrine of individual sovereignty. It is that which has drawn here nearly every person who has come here, except those who were attracted by Warren's equitable commerce. We recognize every person's right to do as he pleases, so long as he does not harm his neighbor. What? Get out of town. All right, so just a note on how marriage was viewed back then. Of course, probably pretty obvious it was a patriarchal system, and that's what they mean. It was more of like how modern marriage is looked at. So with more equal rights among the people in the marriage, man and woman. Despite the evident evolution of the radical community into a more and more conventional town, Ellis remained highly suspicious of its moral influence, remarking in the manner of Anthony Comstock, that such a settlement, outwardly so attractive, for it is a pretty place, and yet so corrupt at heart, should exist almost within the shadow of the metropolis of the nation, is a circumstance full of danger. Warren remained interested in modern times to his death. Although no longer connected with the community in any capacity, he was convinced that there was more to it than its critics had seen. Although begun as an experiment, he was pleased to see it still surviving when moved to comment upon it in 1872. Not revealing the source of his information, he remarked that the village was a very pretty one, improving faster than anyone in the neighborhood. After a recital of its increased physical attractions, he revealed his knowledge that the name had been changed. Since the very mention of modern times had often been a cause of provocation, now, he remarked, the annoyance from that source is at an end. He did not indicate to his readers that the economic aspects of his internationally known community were no longer of significance. Codman, who was to become the patriarch of the community and the last survivor of its early folk, was inclined to be critical of Warren. He located part of the failure to achieve greater prominence to Warren's poor qualities as a leader. He pointed up the latter's hesitancy and lack of command as a public speaker, his timidity and distaste for wrangling and discussion, and his general retiring nature. Warren, quote, had no magnetic qualities so needful in persuasion of gaining converts, end quote, Codman asserted. If he had had the gift or art of leadership, the fortune of this village would have been different. Yet, all was not gloom from Codman's point of view. His testimonial to the worth of modern times in his own history is unmatched in its positive quality. Codman writes, as an equity village, 'twas a success as far as it went, and in its practical working, no flaws were found in the principles as formulated by Mr. Warren, nor were the principles ever successfully challenged. None of us had the desire for riches. Equity was the ruling motive. That was what we were here to establish. Our aim was to show by example that better conditions for living were possible, that equity could be made actual, and that living could be made worthwhile. We may have been speculators in morality, but not in the land or its products. From the standpoint of worldly ambition, we failed. Yet we had the cheering hope that our lives had not been entirely for self, that our social experiment might be a factor in the moralization of humanity, and that we had assisted in keeping alive the aspirations of social progress. A few of the community people were still living in Brentwood after the turn of the century, with the pleasant external features of the town and cooperative tendencies the primary attractions. However, the buildings of the original settlement had for the most part long disappeared. Scarcely a physical vestige of modern times was to survive into the 20th century. Modern times, as an experiment in practical anarchism, is not easily evaluated. In a sociological sense, it is significant that no account, even including those of critics, has ever made mention of the presence at any time of crime as a community problem. The lack of disorder or violence in the absence of constituted authority for this extended period is challenge to promoters of the widespread belief that organized society on any level without such formality is doomed to chaos. The modest size undoubtedly must be taken into consideration of this particular problem, however. Indictments of the Warrenite settlement have usually concentrated in a non-coercive attitude toward its eccentrics and the lower material standard of living as compared with nearby New York City. From the point of view that institutions and attitudes of a particular group are more correctly judged with relation to their impact upon that group than upon the outside, neither of these contentions are particularly relative. Adherence to Warren's assertion that group opinion determined the actual operation of a community, individual behavior at modern times was usually evaluated in the same terms, an essential corollary to a type of life founded upon unconditional respect for individual personality. As an old resident explained, the passive boycott became the principal weapon utilized against undesirables, a device of undisputed quality in their practical experience. That guy said, when we wish to rid ourselves of unpleasant persons, we simply let them alone. We buy nothing of them, sell them nothing, exchange no words with them. In short, by establishing a complete system of non-intercourse with them, we show them unmistakably that they are not wanted here, and they usually go away of their own accord. This is like brilliant stuff. Like this is such non-violence. Like just disconnect, sever ties, goodbye. A judgment of relative material prosperity and similarly of not a special consequence. No evidence exists to warrant the belief that the colonists expected to become wealthy or even well-to-do, while the statements of the colonists point to other factors, ranging from the expectation of merely proving theories in practice to the achievement of deliberate functional poverty, with its attendant sense of fulfillment. It is as planned retreats from the vitiating influences of city life that modern times and utopia are of potential interest to modern proponents of decentralization. As an interlude in American social history, the story of these towns stands apart from that of its cousins. Okay, so to wrap up that chapter, it's a pretty, well, maybe we should just continue, but it's a pretty it's a pretty good explanation. It's a pretty good example of how early and a couple of early anarchist communities operated. I particularly enjoy that part about how they got rid of people that they did not want to associate with. And the lack of reports of violence in these communities is astonishing. Let's see here. I have... Okay, so maybe we continue this at a different time. Yeah, we'll continue this at a different time. So, yeah, let's go back to the book cam here. Men Against the State. Okay. And, so just to wrap this up, thank you guys for tuning in. And yeah, it was a rough one to get through. Honestly, I could have probably dealt with about maybe 1/4 of the information that was given in that last chunk there, that last section. This for anyone that's made it this far, if you listen to this whole thing, you contact me and I got something for you. I'll give you something. Don't worry, it's not a joke. Seriously, contact me and you'll get something out of it. Go to voluntaristacademy.com and go to the contact page to do so. Join the mailing list, the newsletter. Consider becoming a member, and you can join the Discord community, and we can have a town hall, and we can all hang out, and you can talk to me, and We can form a community of our own. I know what it's like to feel lonely when you're coming across information such as this. So the least I could do is provide a community in which we can all kind of gather and make friends and kind of like, you know, see a little bit of light in the darkness. Check out the links in the show notes. Brendan Daniel, very talented musician. He provides the music for this program. And again, consider getting... Chris Jantzen was on the Independence Day special, by the way, on this channel. And consider getting yourself a copy of this book. Let's read the back. So, The Book That Changed My Life by Chris Jantzen. Chris Jantzen is the host of the End Evil podcast. He examines natural law, trauma programming, mind control, symbolism, and the mechanisms of societal control. The message is raw and heartfelt, challenging the normalization of coercion and authoritarianism statism. He exposes moral relativism in all its deceptive forms, revealing it as true destroyer of freedom, evil itself. Moral relativism is evil itself. Good job, Chris. Very well said. So about this book, this is not your average self-help or philosophy book. This is a raw, no-holds-barred blueprint for anyone ready to tear down the invisible walls society has built around their mind, body, and spirit. This book guides you on a journey from the winding trails of your own inner landscape to the towering structures of control that doctrinate the outer world. All right, very good, Chris. Shout out Chris Jantzen. Go get his book. And then, while you're there getting his own book, consider getting yourself a facsimile copy of The End of All Evil by Jeremy Locke, because Chris has somehow been able to be a seller of those. Perhaps he has thousands of copies of them for himself. That's going to be it for tonight, folks. Remember on your way out that taxation is not only theft, it is slavery, and you own yourself. Period. At the end of the day, that is the truth. You really do. You own yourself. And if you're here, then I appreciate you. And we'll see you next time.